hand the program over to Kathy Giesel. Kathy is the newest member of the Commonwealth North Board of Directors. She's, of course, no stranger to Alaskans. She served in the Alaska State Senate from 2011 to 2021. In addition to representing District N in the Senate, Kathy served as Senate President from 2019 to 2021. So Kathy, thanks for filling in for Scott Jepson today. He's on the road and I know he appreciates your stepping forward. And go ahead and unmute and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Juanetta. And good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Carbon Dividends, a Bipartisan Climate Solution. The idea for today's presentation actually began 16 months ago. It came out of Commonwealth North's Energy Policy Study Group. So this group had invited these speakers, and after hearing them, there was general consensus, we need to have them back doing a monthly forum. And that's what we're doing today. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to thank the underwriters who help support Commonwealth North and its many programs. Those underwriters are Alaska Communications, ConocoPhillips Alaska, North Rim Bank, and the University of Alaska Anchorage Institute of Social and Economic Research. These folks provide vital support for Commonwealth North's programs and operations, and we thank them for their generosity. Now, let me introduce today's speakers. So the first speaker will be Ryan Costello. Ryan is the founder of RCS. This is a governmental affairs consultancy that he founded. He also serves as a strategic advisor for Americans for Carbon Dividends. This is an organization that advocates on behalf of the Baker-Schultz carbon pricing plan. This plan is a market-based solution to aggressively address the climate challenge. He previously spent 16 years in public service and in private law practice. As a member of the US House of Representatives from 2015 to 2019, he represented a portion of the Philadelphia suburbs. Catrina Rorke is Vice President for Policy at the Climate Leadership Council. In this role, she develops the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends proposal in consultation with 46 founding members of that council. These members include corporate leaders, environmental nonprofits, and influential individuals. She also manages the council's research programs and supports the council's advocacy and outreach activities. Kevin Sweeney is a familiar name to Alaskans. He's the president of the lobbying firm 6-7. He also serves as strategic advisor to Americans for Carbon Dividends. He has over 20 years of public and governmental relations experience in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Kevin spent a decade working in the US Senate, where he served as press secretary and state director. In 2010, he managed the successful and historic write-in campaign for Senator Lisa Murkowski. I also want to thank Steve Rice, who is behind the scenes today. He's with Americans for the Carbon Dividend, and he's managing the PowerPoint slides for our speakers, and that's a critical piece too. On behalf of Commonwealth North and our audience today, I want to thank and welcome our panelists. Before the panelists begin, I want to extend my thanks to Commonwealth North members who are online with us today. We're grateful for your participation in these programs and the study groups, as well as your commitment to citizen engagement in public policy. For those of you that are not members, we always want to take a moment to invite you to join Commonwealth North. Now, I've talked about our policy group on energy. That's the genesis of today's presentation, but we have other policy groups also on the subject of Arctic policy, fiscal policy, food security, and coming soon, healthcare costs policy. We'll talk more about that at the end, and we will provide a link for you in the chat window for more information about membership options. So now let's get to our guests. Ryan Costello, you're up first. So please unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Kevin, you're raising your hand. I think you're gonna start the slides.
Yeah, so I think Kathy, I'm actually gonna start this off, Kathy. I think maybe we had the order incorrect there.
Oh, of course, certainly.
And Kathy, my role really at the beginning here is to be the sort of MC and kick this off. And so you did such a good job. You made this very easy for me. Thanks, Juanetta, Commonwealth North, for allowing us to present again on carbon dividends. This is our second time in front of the organization. We came back in person in February of 2020. We remember those great times to give a brief overview of our plan. And we're back today to provide some more details and to update you on the progress towards bipartisan action in Congress. Like Juanetta had mentioned, we plan to leave plenty of time for your questions after our presentation. And we really do look forward to hearing from you and having an informative and lively discussion. So to start the presentation, I'm going to now turn it over to Catrina Rorke. She's going to give you an overview of the organization and the carbon dividend policy. Catrina?
Thanks so much, Kevin. As Kathy mentioned, we work with about 4 dozen now founding members from across the spectrum. So we have a whole bunch of companies, standout industry leaders in a variety of sectors, automakers, consumer products, banks, technology firms, insurers, you name it, we want to bring them to the table, benefit from their expertise. We also have a really deep bench of energy founding members who represent all sorts of different aspects of the energy industry. So pulling fuel out of the ground, getting it to customers, making solar panels, installing them. Again, we want to benefit from as many corners of expertise as we can. We also have 3 standout environmental founding members. They help us stay honest to the environmental ambition of our plan. We're here to address the climate challenge. They keep us on our toes there. And then some distinguished individuals who lend their own experience and their own enthusiasm for solving a challenge like climate change. They've represented a variety of positions in administrations across the aisle. They bring really great expertise and a bipartisan foundation to the work that we do. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see our distinguished co-authors. The genesis of this plan was on the right by former Republican secretaries of you name it, James Baker and the late George Shultz. They started this off and we've grown to get perspectives from this full list here. I'll talk to you a little bit about what the framework of our plan looks like. We describe it as 4 pillars, but I just want to make sure that we all understand that these are not individual. They're meant to be deployed together. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. The first is a gradually rising fee on carbon emissions. This fee would start around $40 a ton and rise 5% over time. That's enough to cut our emissions of CO2 emissions in half by 2035 if this is the only thing that we do on greenhouse gas emissions. That can generate a substantial amount of revenue. We want to send that revenue back to American households in the form of carbon dividends on a per capita basis. Make sure that households are in the driver's seat for deciding how these dollars should be spent and adapting to a carbon-free future. The third pillar is regulatory simplification. A carbon fee is simply the most powerful instrument to reduce emissions across the economy. We don't need regulations too, so we propose to roll back the authority for the government to issue new regulations in sectors that will decarbonize rapidly with this price in play. The fourth is border carbon adjustments, which allow the United States to tap into what we call the carbon advantage. We are a more efficient economy than our competitors overseas. We have no way of benefiting from that now. If we implement a border carbon adjustment, not only are we putting domestic firms on a level playing field, giving them a leg up on the competition. That's the framework of our plan. With the input of our founding members, we released the Bipartisan Climate Roadmap. And this is the sort of foundational document of what we do at the Climate Leadership Council. We're trying to build the case that this is the winning policy for addressing CO2 emissions in the United States and sort of shifting the game on what it means to enact ambitious climate policy. That's the background on the policy side of things. Let me put on my research hat and tell you about some work that we've done in building the case for this roadmap as the pathway forward. So we have compared our policy to using a suite of regulations to accomplish the same climate outcomes. We find that if you use our carbon fee instead, you're generating an additional $190 billion per year in GDP on average. That's a huge win. Using a price instead of regulations unleashes the economy. It's a really important contribution if we want to win the future. I mentioned the carbon advantage. That is that the US is a more efficient manufacturer of goods across the spectrum. So we've compared the US carbon efficiency against those of our competitors. We find not only is the US clean, the US is so dramatically cleaner than some really key trade partners that we have, particularly China, India, Russia. They emit far more CO2 emissions for everything they make than we do. So we want to create a benefit for clean manufacturers at home. We've looked at how households will fare if we enact the carbon dividends plan. Even in Alaska, in a very high energy cost, high cost state, we find that the combination of the fee and a dividend on a per capita basis allows most Alaskans to come out better off under carbon dividends than they would be without it, particularly low and middle income Alaskans. Another key benefit. Excuse me. Emissions, we're serious about cutting CO2 emissions. And if we enact our carbon fee, again, we will cut emissions in half by 2035. That makes us not only consistent with the international goals set through the Paris Accord, but with the goals of this administration. They want to cut emissions in half by 2030. Using our plan as the centerpiece makes everything a whole lot easier. And then I'll leave you with driving innovation. So if we rely on a carbon dividends plan to decarbonize the US economy, we'll see a tremendous amount of new investment, $1.4 trillion of new investment in the most innovative corners of the economy, creating 1.6 million new jobs. You'll see from this graphic that we anticipate a whole heck of a lot of those jobs in renewable industry and CO2 capture, but we're talking economy-wide here. We can see tremendous jobs and investment benefits from the carbon dividends plan. I know I ran through that fast. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I hope this gave you a nice taste of what we're talking about here today. Kevin, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So Alaska clearly is at the front lines of climate change. And this is a serious issue that's confronting our state. And I think if you're here today to listen to our presentation, you recognize that. And many of our elected officials are working hard to address this crisis. We've had success both at the state and federal levels. We've had commitments. When it comes to Senator Rakowski, she has clearly made climate change a priority. She's been a leader in providing for investments in new technologies, infrastructure, most recently in the energy bill that she and Senator Manchin got across the finish line in the last Congress. But when it's come to a more comprehensive climate policy like the one we're pushing, Senator Rakowski and most Alaskans have always maintained we need to make sure that any climate action does not simply shut down the economy. And in Alaska, a state that relies so much on a resource development economy, making sure that resource development can continue to play a vital role in our economy and be part of the solution as we look to solve climate. So we've been talking to Senator Rakowski now for a couple years about our policy. She's expressed interest in carbon dividends as a way to make meaningful reductions while protecting jobs and rewarding innovation. And this is just an example of sort of a recent quote she's made in favor of our approach. Moving on, in addition, we've been sharing our plan with Alaskans across the state. And this is just to show you sort of an example of some of the broad support that we've garnered, both from former Governor Walker and Jackson Blackwell and Kobe Risk, who are young conservatives, part of an organization that is getting behind this approach. But we're also co-chairs of Senator Sullivan's most reelect. And so this is really a good example of the broad support that we started with this policy when it came to making sure that it is something that we can get support from environmentalists, support from the business industry, support from scientists, support from economists. And we want to keep doing more of this in the state to educate people on our plan, get feedback, and make sure that what we're doing clearly addresses the issue at hand. We're also making lots of progress back in DC with policymakers back here. So we want to spend a little time talking about some of the updates on some of the other senators and congressmen that are talking about this, and some of the organizations outside of even our founding members that have now recognized that this is a far better approach to dealing with climate change than simply leaving it up to runaway regulations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you. So as we can see from the screen here, Senator Romney has been very forward-looking in both his perspective on how to solve this problem, as well as looking at our plan as the solution. He has made, it seems like every week he's on a different podcast, and he will reference the framework of our plan, as well as oftentimes the coalition that we've built. You can also see Senator Graham, who has really reinserted himself in this dialogue since his reelection. And we are working closely with both offices in an effort to gain their support as co-sponsors to the bill. Do we have another slide coming up? Wonderful. Here you see both Climate Envoy John Kerry. I never know which title to use with him because he's had several, as well as Secretary Yellen, who, as you all may know, was a member of the Climate Leadership Council. The point in emphasizing this here is that the very critical figures in the administration understand the positive impact that carbon pricing has on solving the climate challenge. And we think that that is going to be extremely helpful as we move this legislatively through Congress. We have another slide. Wonderful. I think this is probably the single most significant breakthrough for us in the past several months, and that is API, the Chamber, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the Business Roundtable, three preeminent associations here in Washington, D.C., all come out in favor of a price on carbon as being the appropriate legislative response and the appropriate framework from which to deal with climate. Each of them has done that in their own unique way. API, I think, has probably been the most explicit. The Chamber indicates that through its phrase market-based approach, but clearly, a price is the market signal that we need in order to make this, the plan work, and is really the central piece of the plan. And BRT, and in particular, some members of BRT have spoke at specific length about how the dividend they feel is the right political solution. So you also see a comment there from the Association of American Railroads. What we're seeing, and the point of these slides is to indicate that we have those in the Senate and in the House who are lined up, and we have associations here, very significant associations, historically center-right associations, all speaking the same language that is consistent with our policy framework. Any other slides for me? We may have one. Yes, maybe one more after this, but this one's important too. Look, this is not any longer just Democrats or liberals who speak about climate as a challenge that needs to be resolved. A great majority of Republicans, and increasingly, overwhelmingly, a great majority of younger Republicans and younger voters view a solution as needed, and it needs to be bipartisan. And I can tell you just from a little bit of experience with having served in Congress with healthcare reform, that if you just have one party offering a solution or passing a bill, the other party is going to seek to unwind it ultimately. And that's why having a bipartisan nucleus to this is really critical in its infancy in order to grow support from there. I may have, yes, one more. So, this is a very political argument here, but this is also something I think is very helpful for Republicans to be mindful of. We are not, as a Republican Party, in a position where folks identify the political brand with a solution set for rising sea levels, for resiliency measures that are needed from infrastructure, and an energy policy that's consistent with the resources that we have and grid modernization efforts. So on that front, we have really, and I have very much focused with Kevin and some others, Catrina, on getting Republicans to understand our plan and ultimately support it. And there are a number of reasons why they should support it. Just today, I had 3 meetings on the Hill with Greg Bertelsen, the CEO of Climate Leadership Council. And, some members want to talk about the impact of the dividend and how that may offset some inflationary pressures in the marketplace. Others are extremely focused on geopolitical considerations and making sure China isn't allowed to pollute and import a bunch of cheap products here that puts us increasingly at a competitive disadvantage. And they'd like to see, frankly, a carbon border adjustment, which brings about more competitiveness for the American worker and companies that are located in the United States of America. So there's other reasons too. My point is simply, focusing on the policy levers of this plan is the way to get not only Republicans to support it, but Republicans to feel comfortable speaking about it and how climate change is connected with many other issues that are extremely important to economic growth, to national security, to an infrastructure package that is reflective of our needs in this country, agricultural concerns, is another broad area. All of that feeds into what we're trying to do from a comprehensive climate solution package. And with that, do I have one more slide or not? I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Is this me? Am I doing this, Kevin? Or am I turning this back? I think I'm turning this back to you, Kevin. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kevin.
You guys hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I wasn't sure if I was up. So I want to spend just a quick few minutes on these last few slides because I do want to leave some time. But this is just a highlight. We've been in the field with More Information Group, who's a pollster. This is different than Ivanmore. This is an organization that both Senator Sullivan and Senator Murkowski have used for their Senate races, just to gauge, where Alaskans are on the issue of climate change and whether they'd support an approach like ours. So if we go to the next slide, we asked just flat out the level of concern among Alaskans about climate change. And the question basically was, over the last year, have you become more concerned or less concerned, or about the same? And you can see overwhelmingly by 4-to-1 margin, people are more concerned than they are less concerned. This just illustrates that people understand, and they're understanding it at a greater level, the need to address climate change. Go to the next slide. And then we asked them about just our plan. And this was before we've ever done any education. We talked about what the sort of basics of our plan would be and whether they would support that approach. And again, we had great support, 57 to 32. Of course, anytime you mention dividends with people in Alaska, there's confusion around the permanent fund. And so when we qualified and let them know that this was separate from the permanent fund and would be in addition to the permanent fund, the support goes up even greater to 63-27. Moving to the next one. But what I find very interesting is, even though Alaskans, when they find out this is an additional dividend, support the plan more, when we asked them about our 4 pillars of the plan, the dividend was actually the one that received the least amount of support. What's received the most amount of support is the other aspects of our plan. And number one, which we found not only in Alaska, we found this anywhere we've done polling, is that this policy would put other countries like China that are getting away with their pollution, make them level the playing field and make them if they want to export goods to the United States, make sure that they have to pay the same fee that we would. And so I think that's always a concern that comes up whenever you talk about how are we going to address this global issue? Well, America can't go at it alone. And that part of the plan is the one that Alaskans support the most. But you can see here that all 4 pillars of the plan receive at least 60% support. I think that's the last slide. With that, we thank you again for your patience in letting us get through this presentation. It went probably a little longer than we thought, but should be plenty of time for questions, and thank you.
Well, thanks so much, panelists, Ryan, Catrina, and Kevin. That was very interesting. This is a very interesting proposal, and it's a complex problem. I appreciate especially the polling that you presented. So I know there have been some questions rolling in. Juanetta, would you handle the questions for the panelists, please?
Great, thanks, Kathy. I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight our panelists, and we'll get everybody on screen here. Great. Well, we do have some questions for you, and I'll just start with, we have a question from Lorelei Simon, and she's asking, where will the carbon fee originate? Will it be a tax imposed on fuel producers like oil, gas, and coal companies?
Yeah, so we envision this as an upstream carbon fee. So it'll be priced on fuels as they come into the economy, and then at facilities that have high emissions, like power facilities. Thanks.
All right. So another question is, have you had conversations with the oil patch in Alaska about the carbon dividend plan? What kind of responses have you received, if so? And what kind of impacts are they anticipating this plan might have on the industry? I note from your list of supporters that ConocoPhillips is involved, and historic Alaska operator BP is also involved. So what are you hearing from the oil patch in Alaska?
Yeah, so you saw that of our original founding members, there are some major players, both past and present, with BP and Shell, and then today Exxon and Conoco. So they are committed to our plan and behind our plan. But we recognize that, you know, there's much more to Alaska resource development than the big operators. And so we've done our due diligence in having conversations with AOGA, with representatives from RDC, with some of the new players like Oil Search, talking to Hillcorp. And really what we want to do is understand the impacts that we're going to have. One of the things that we found, not only is the carbon advantage in the United States, not only do we produce goods cleaner, but we produce energy cleaner. So we are able to, whether it's mine metals better, or metals and minerals better, whether it's taking oil and natural gas out of the ground, producing coal, we do that better and more efficiently than other countries. And in Alaska, many of those places many fields we're doing actually better than the US. We want to be able to talk to them to understand exactly what that advantage is, so that they have a clear calculation of what this means for their business. Because when it comes to the industry support for this, it's all about the certainty. What a price on carbon does is provide certainty. They know what the rules are. They know how to price investments, future investments. When it's just a series of regulations, one after another, you can't plan. And so this is a trade-off. We're getting rid of the regulations. We're putting a freeze on new regulations. And for that, we're setting a price on carbon so that we know with certainty how to make investments in the future.
Right. Well, that actually answers one of the other questions about really why is a market-based approach better than a regulatory approach? So I think you've answered that, but does anybody have any additional comments about the relative merits of a market-based approach versus a regulatory one?
I think Kevin did a really complete job, but I'll just throw in that we did that research. Happy to share the report that we completed. If we use our price-based instrument instead of a suite of regulations to achieve the same exact emissions reductions, we're talking about, on average, $190 billion in additional GDP with our plan. So it's not just theoretically better. It doesn't just create certainty. It unleashes economic growth.
Great. Can one of you speak to the mechanics of the border parity pillar? What are the mechanics of that? How does that operate? And how does that fit in with any other existing trade rules with tariffs or what have you?
It's great. So it gets technical fast on the border carbon adjustment. If I go too deep, somebody pull me up. The border carbon adjustment is designed to ensure that as we import goods from other countries, they face the same exact carbon fee as domestic producers. That sets us on a level playing field, and it gives the most advantage to the cleanest producers. At the same time, as we export goods outside of the United States, we roll that carbon fee back, so that if you're not selling in the United States, you're not paying the US carbon price. That allows us to export our goods without not just additional regulatory charges, but without our carbon charge. It allows the destination economies to figure out what they want to do with the goods. So think of it as an adjustment for the carbon price at the border, sort of independent of things that we think of as like tariffs or quantity measures that we might apply to specific goods or what have you. It is a border adjustment for the carbon price itself. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay. We have a question from George Donard. Unfortunately, he's having connectivity problems, so he's probably not still with us, but he says he'll listen to the recording later, so he's anticipating these. He notes that the EU is enacting a border carbon adjustment in 2023. What does that mean in terms of a timeline to enact something like the carbon dividend program here?
Another terrific question. So the European Union is moving forward. We'll see what their proposal looks like in July. At this point, we have no idea what the amount of the adjustment will be, how it will work with our internal systems, which goods it will apply to, from which countries. We're sort of in a black box right now, so we can speak theoretically. They're imposing what they call the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Same concept, because they can't reach the emissions reductions that they have pledged to the international community without it. They can't hold domestic industry to the kinds of standards needed to reduce emissions. So their emissions are staying stubbornly high. They're trying to find out if the carbon border adjustment mechanism will give them more flexibility to have more rigorous internal climate policies to reach their targets. So we'll see what they come up with, but it seems that their policy won't be as complete, and it won't be as equitable as the one we're talking about here. They're not talking about adjusting for their internal policies. They're talking about protecting their industries so that they can turn the climate screws on them.
All right, thanks. George has another question here, and I'll maybe add a little bit to it. He says spending money is really popular these days. Do you see the Climate Leadership Council proposal as a substitute or a supplement to other climate initiatives? I guess where do things line up with?
What was the last part of that? A substitute or a what?
Or a supplement to other current climate initiatives. He doesn't mention which ones, but I guess what I would say is you've referenced the potential for an infrastructure bill, because of how far reaching this kind of proposal is, could it possibly be coupled with some other piece of legislation? I guess more to the point is there a vehicle and a sponsor that might be moving things forward?
So let me just share a thought on that. Look, what's going to happen this summer, I think, will be much more infrastructure and tax related than climate. But I do think you have to look at this plan as a supplement, but more the impetus behind other policies that would harmonize or be complementary to this policy. And I mean that in two big broad ways. One, if you talk about infrastructure, right? Like if you advanced building materials, the way that we build roads, the way that we build buildings can be done in a manner that are less carbon intensive than they are. And there's agricultural practices. There's all sorts of stuff, right? Such a bad word, stuff. There's all sorts of stuff that can be done and that will be done if a price is on carbon, because there'll be a price signal and an incentive to do things that emit less carbon. Right now, there's no incentive to do otherwise, right? The externalities are borne by society rather than those who emit. The second thing that I'd like to say is when you put a price on carbon, you are essentially saying to corporate America, you should invest in R&D, you should accelerate your technology in order to emit less carbon and to look at energy sources and resources that don't emit carbon or emit less or that capture the carbon. That is done through DOE, R&D programs. That is done, frankly, internally at every single energy company as we speak right now. But it takes on a much more significant piece of what they're doing, right, policy-wise, which can be supported by government policy, than is currently the case right now. So I do think that a lot of things flow from this policy that are additional policies that are, number one, not inconsistent with this, but actually are facilitative off of this policy.
Okay. Well, George has one final thought, which is that from a purely political standpoint, I guess it's easy for Democrats to favor climate policies, but a little bit more difficult for Republicans. And it's not as hard as it used to be, but it's still difficult in his estimation. So he says, thank you very much for creating some space with your initiative. And when do you think or anticipate that there might be a bipartisan bill introduced along these lines?
We think when the fireworks are going off on July 4th, you will either have just recently read about it or will be shortly reading about it. That is our intention, to have bicameral, bipartisan bill introduction. As you might imagine, when you're talking about a bill this comprehensive, and you have elected officials who have indicated a certain level of support, and you're dealing with the legislative staff and dotting I's and crossing T's and having what's called legislative counsel in the Senate and in the House, which are not in the specific offices, but any bill has to go to Leg Counsel. There are those sorts of intricacies that are getting fleshed out, and we don't control bill introduction, but we are very far down the line in terms of garnering support. And now we're dealing with some final details that we don't control the specific timing on, but which we think lends itself to the very ambiguous timeline I provided you. If someone else wants to be more specific, they can.
All right. We have another question from Lorelei Simon. She's asking, please explain how the tax that turns into a dividend creates wealth.
So I guess I'll just explain the mechanics of the policy. So we're imposing a fee on carbon emissions. It gets assessed on fuels as they enter the economy and on sources of emissions that are not otherwise covered. And that collects a lot of revenue. So what do you do with it? The federal government, I'm sure, could think of thousands of clever ways to spend it. But perhaps the most clever way is to ask households to accept it and to use it to make the investments that they care to. It can be a new water heater. It can be summer camp. It can be a new television for the big game. The idea is to take decision-making about the specifics about what the future should look like out of the hands of government and into the hands of U.S. households.
Thank you. Kevin, you mentioned that Senator Murkowski has been focused on climate issues. Can you say anything about any other discussions you may have had with Congressman Young or Senator Sullivan and where they may be on some of these issues?
We've briefed Senator Sullivan and Congressman Young and their staff a handful of times on the issue. They've expressed interest for different reasons. I think both of them really perk up when you talk about the border cost adjustment and what it can do to really bring home a lot of American manufacturing jobs. I don't want to get too far out in front of Catrina. She may want to talk about some of the great things that we're doing and maybe coming on that side of it. But when it comes to our policy, I think Senator Murkowski has been much more engaged, but there's definitely been some interest from the other members of the delegation. This is really one where, when we've talked to a lot of members about this, they love this approach. They love taking a market-based approach as opposed to just, you know, like I've said before, just sit there and take whatever regulations come. But they want to see something concrete that they can get behind first. And when we're talking about doing a bipartisan bill, a bicameral bill, at a minimum, you've got 4 members. We hope to have more. And so we start with our policy. We present kind of the bones and the structure of what the policy is. But in order to build strong coalition for something that can work further down the line, we're not quite sure 100% what that final bill is going to look like. And I think once that final bill is presented, introduced, there's excitement around it, the coalition, the companies, the organizations that have been saying, this is the approach we want, they actually come out and say, thank you, that is what we wanted. We weren't just paying lip service to this issue. Then that attracts other members. And so some are taking a wait and see, but when it comes to the delegation, they've expressed some interest in the policy and especially some of the key specific components of it.
Great, thank you, Kevin. All right, I'm going to make one last call for questions from the audience. And also I'm going to bring Kathy back in on Spotlight. And Kathy, do you have any other questions for our panel today?
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate the bipartisan approach and the concept of China helping to pay its way for the damage that it's causing to Alaska. I know you guys know that the air currents, the global air currents, carried a lot of that particulate matter over the state of Alaska, dropping black particles on our snow cover, which contributes to rapid melting of it in the spring. So we have to deal with a lot of those issues, even here up in the Arctic. So I appreciate that they will be called to task, so to speak. I am hopeful that American manufacturing will rise to the occasion, right? If we're going to be taxing things coming from China, we talked about a gas pipeline here in Alaska. We were faced with the dilemma of where to get the steel. So, so there's those elements. Do you see that our American manufacturing will actually accelerate?
Yeah, Kathy, a great question. And maybe I'll offer an answer in 2 parts. The first is that your commentary on China is enormously relevant. There's no silver bullet to solve climate change, and there is no, US only policy that can solve climate change. The best version of a US policy is one that forces international actors to pay their fair share and sort of builds leverage to get more ambitious action internationally. A border carbon adjustment is just the ticket to do that. It transforms the way we engage in international diplomacy if countries have to be responsible for the emissions that they're exporting to other countries. An excellent lever point for us to use with our trading partners in China. On the question of US industry, we see that even today, even in the absence of this policy, US industry has a really incredible carbon advantage against many of our international trading partners. If you compare where our economy is today against that of Europe, which has had comprehensive climate policy for nearly 20 years now, they're just a smidge cleaner than we are. So that means that the US economy has picked every opportunity to innovate and reduce its emissions footprint. Where the game is set, we're doing really well. If we introduce this policy and tilt the incentives even more in the favor of decarbonization, we're going to widen that carbon advantage against our international partners. It's a key benefit of our policy is that it builds on the carbon footprint that we have now, which is low, and it helps us sort of lower it even more, leverage even more against our international trading partners through the future. At the same time that we're building investment and creating jobs in the most innovative corners of our economy. It's a clear win for US industry. And as Kevin mentioned, Alaskan industry, we know that energy production in Alaska is cleaner than the international energy industry and even than the lower 48 oil and gas production. Border carbon adjustments are a terrific tool for being able to leverage that in international trade, and the carbon price is a terrific tool for being able to leverage that for domestic trade.
Well, thank you for that, Catrina. You know, another thing I think of related to China is our rare earth elements and their refining. We don't refine any of those in the US. I think, well, I pause. I think there is one small refinery somewhere in the lower 48, but Alaska has a bucket full of rare earth elements, and yet we send them to China to be refined, who does not do a good job, of course, with climate change and control of carbon emissions. And then we buy them back. And so will this increase the cost of our rare earth elements, which are critical in manufacturing to reduce our carbon emissions? Do you see the do loop we can get into?
Yeah, I think I understand. So let's be straightforward. We're talking about a carbon fee. A carbon fee is going to increase prices across the economy, depending on how much fossil fuel you use in the manufacture. So the short answer is we will see price increases, including price increases for things like rare earth minerals. Because of the border carbon adjustment, we will also see that impact on overseas production. Chinese mineral production is enormously dirty. We all know that to be true anecdotally. The data bears it out. We have an advantage. I think it's about 4.5 to 1. So that means that for every ton of emissions we produce in the United States in mining, they produce 4.5. We can benefit from that advantage. We can drive investment in rare earth mineral development in the United States if we implement policies like this that hold emitters accountable overseas. And we know we're going to need rare earth minerals as we move forward in the renewable energy transition. So it's a commodity we need. It's a supply chain that we need to secure. Let's pick the best tools to leverage it. I'll note, yes, prices across the economy will go up depending on how much fossil fuel you need. That's why we have the dividend. We want households to be prepared, put on the best foot forward as we make this transition. Thanks, Kathy.
Kathy, we have one last question from the audience. It's from Lorelei Simon, and it actually, I think, speaks to some of the conversation that you were just having. So Lorelei is saying, how is this concept not simply just passing money between hands? If the government raises taxes on producers, then producers will raise money on their customers, like the generation industry, and the generators will pass those price increases along to their customers, the ratepayers. So how is this not just sort of cycling costs amongst players, and ultimately the ratepayer that pays to more just to receive this dividend? Why not keep the money in their hands in the first place?
I think I understand the question. So as we move forward to decarbonize, there are several instruments that we can use to do so. The most prominent that we talk about today are things like regulations, so direct regulation on what a facility can do, a clean energy standard, or things like a carbon price. We know that a carbon price is not only a more cost-effective instrument, but can generate the revenue that allows households to afford price hikes where they happen and strategize to reduce their carbon footprint over the long term. We don't have that opportunity when it comes to regulation, things like clean energy standards. So if we want to decarbonize using a policy that benefits households the most, the best policy to go with is something that looks a lot like carbon dividends.
Yeah, I'd add to that. There's two things that you would have to be in agreement as to why you would take a policy on this. One is that you really believe that it's critical that we reduce emissions in order to address climate change. But even if you're one that believes that this is maybe more cyclical, that we don't really have to take as many steps to reduce emissions, a recognition that that's where the policy in the United States is headed. And it will be headed, if without a policy like this, it's going to be the regulatory route, which is far less efficient, harms the economy at a much greater rate, and is going to increase prices perhaps even more without the GDP increase that you would get with a plan like this. So it's either, you have a strong belief that climate change needs to be addressed. We must take steps now, which a lot of Alaskans do. And that's why they would support a plan like this. But even Alaskans who perhaps are a little bit more skeptical that we have to take such strong steps to reduce emissions so quickly are pragmatic to know that that's going to be coming down anyway. So let's look at the best possible way to do it. And our plan really addresses both of those concerns.
All right. Just one final thought. Alaska has so many communities that have very unique energy profiles and are operating on microgrids and sometimes very old technology. But we also have some that are very innovative and have a portfolio of energy sources. So how will rural areas with those kinds of distributed energy systems and diverse energy portfolios, how do you think that they will be affected, or how will they respond under a carbon dividend program?
It's such a great question. And I should have mentioned this in my earlier remarks. I'll blame the cold I'm getting over. So built into our policy, we know that there are very many communities in the United States that face already high energy costs. They've done all they can to lower their energy burden, increase efficiency. Imposing a carbon fee isn't going to get greater emissions reductions. It's just going to be punitive. So we've built into the carbon fee an exception for fuels used to generate power or heat homes in communities that face what we call extremely high energy costs. So 275% or more of the national average. People who live in these communities will still get the dividend. We recognize that prices for other things will increase, but they won't bear the carbon fee on fuels consumed for energy purposes where they live. So that'll help a whole heck of a lot. We want to drive innovation. We want to encourage communities to be as innovative as possible. We want that renewable energy, distributed energy resources. Let's bring that all to bear, but we don't want to punish communities that are struggling to deploy those kinds of resources today. So our plan is conscious of the communities that face those costs.
All right, well, Kathy, that's all the questions that I have, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Juanetta. Kevin, I think you used a pivotal word, the word pragmatic. This is coming forward at us, and we have to find a way to solve it. And what you're attempting to do is to work with all sides. And I appreciate that. The bipartisan approach, the pragmatic approach. None of us will think all of this is ideal, right? At the end of the day, most likely. Well, thank you so much, members of the panel, Ryan, Catrina, and Kevin. Thank you for joining us, sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. It's been a great presentation. And thank you to our members and friends who joined us today. Again, if you're not a member of Commonwealth North, I encourage you to go to commonwealthnorth.org and consider joining us. We invite you to join us for our next program. It will be healthcare reform, containing costs and improving outcomes. That's a big order. That meeting will be on June 16th. That's a Wednesday at noon. Our speaker will be Scott Lights. Scott is a senior fellow at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. He's been deeply involved in healthcare reform in Minnesota, and he's served as an analyst and advisor to the Alaska Healthcare Reform Project. Healthcare costs, as we know, is a driving component of our state budget, but our school districts as well, and certainly our businesses, large and small. So this June 16th session will help frame the new healthcare study group that is forming to examine reform options for Alaska. So please join us for that timely program. Have a great day. Thanks so much for joining us. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.